Earlier today, Muhammad Mokaev, a former UFC flyweight, won his fight in the first round in his return to Brave FC. And it is time for Dana White and the UFC to re-sign Muhammad Mokaev. It's not even a want at this point. It's a need for the UFC flyweight division. We're going to break it all down this video. We're going to break down what happened with Mokaev, why the UFC refused to re-sign, and we're going to look at some clips from Mokaev's post-fight press conference at UFC 304, which I really think put the nail in the coffin. We're going to look at some clips from Dana White being absolutely delusional and unhinged and being a complete and utter hypocrite as well. Because this situation is just ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous, especially considering we need contenders in the UFC flyweight division. And instead of having Muhammad Mokaev, who should be the number one contender, may very well be the best flyweight on earth right now. And instead, Dana White, the UFC, Hunter Campbell, whoever else is involved, their egos are too big to potentially re-sign Muhammad Mokaev. Let's break it down, okay? We're going to start off with Muhammad Mokaev at UFC 304. This was the last fight on his deal. He went into the fight, fought Manel Kape. They buried him on the prelims because if you don't know, the UFC does not like when fighters fight out their UFC contracts because basically that gives the fighter leverage. Now, in Mokaev's case, the UFC basically said, oh, well, we don't want to re-sign you. You fight out your deal. But what they typically do is they will bury you on the prelims. They will try to give you a hard matchup when you're fighting out your UFC contract. That's what they did with Mokaev. They buried him on the prelims. He went out there, beat Manel Kape, another ranked win, which should have arguably earned Mokaev a title shot, but instead they refused to re-sign him. Now, this was Mokaev at the UFC 304 post-fight presser, and basically he's talking about what the UFC said to him prior to this fight, which I think is very important. Listen to this.
In front, did they try to give you a new contract before this fight?
They said they're gonna see how I perform. They don't want to see me keep shooting and taking somebody down, but I've done what I could.
They don't want to see him shooting and taking somebody down. The UFC is actively trying to influence fights. This is ridiculous. This should have been the #1 story in MMA. And we've seen other instances of this allegedly happening between the UFC and fighters. And in a second, I'm going to show you a clip of Dana White basically admitting they did tell him that. He denies it and then basically admits it in the same sentence. But let's carry on.
Could do with like tonight, yeah.
They said they didn't like you shooting in there? Is that what they said?
Yeah, they don't like this because they tried to get rid of flyweights before and they don't want this kind of fight. But listen, I'm young. I'm still not in my prime. Like, if they want me to stand and bank with toe-to-toe with this, like, 30 years old grown man, I have to do what's best for me to win.
What exactly happens?
So he went out there. He struck with Manel Kape the majority of the fight. He still won the fight. And the UFC still decided, oh, we don't want to be in the Muhammad Mokaev business. Next clip we're going to look at. They asked Mokaev, you know, is he basically willing to go somewhere else? You know, does he have any idea what he will do if the UFC doesn't re-sign him? And he talks about his dream as being UFC champion. Listen to this.
No, I don't even look at other organization now. My dream is become UFC champion, and I'm doing everything. I was worried about my performance, not because like Manel Kape or somebody in front. I was worried about my future life. If I didn't perform well today, if I lose, maybe UFC kick me out, and I had a lot of pressure thinking about my future. I have to feed my family. I don't know what else I can do in my life apart from fighting in the best organization in the world.
So now we know afterwards they refused to re-sign him. They didn't even offer him a new deal. And then he went to Brave FC where he fought. I almost said debuted, but he fought there in the past. But he fought his first fight on his new contract with Brave FC earlier today and got a first-round finish via submission. And this is just sad, man. The fact that we got one of the best flyweights in the world outside the UFC, all because of Dana White and the UFC's ego and their poor, sorry excuses for why they didn't want to re-sign Mokaev, which we're going to expose in a second. I've even done a video back when Dana White made these comments. But the last thing I want to look at from the Mokaev interview is like, how can you not want this guy? This guy's willing to fight anyone. He wasn't even demanding a title shot here. He said, I'll fight anyone even if it's not for the title. I think I'm deserving. I want a title shot, but even if it's not for the title, I'll fight anyone.
But now I just fight anyone. When I was younger, just came to UFC after Cody Durden's. I called out Manel Kape and he said, who are you? You just came to UFC. I'm above ranking. But I was above ranked might not capture this fight, but I said I will fight him. So it doesn't matter to me who to fight.
Congrats.
Not hiding behind his ranking, willing to fight guys behind him in the rankings, not begging for a title shot. I'll beat anyone they put in front of me. But this wasn't good enough for the UFC because afterwards, Dana White said this. So I want to show this clip because Dana was insufferable this night, and he basically hated the entire UFC 304 card. It seemed like he was upset that Belal Muhammad won the title, dominated Leon Edwards, dumped him on his bald spot. And this set the tone for the UFC 304 presser, which then he goes on a rant about Muhammad Mokaev and basically refuses to re-sign him publicly, which not only is, I mean, just a bad look for business overall, but it just made him look like a complete and utter egomaniac, which we knew he already was, but we didn't realize, he said, you know what, I can't afford to pay Mokaev, but, I'm going to hire Jelly Bean to push her around in this suitcase. But let's watch what Dana had to say here about post-fight bonuses.
Every time you get on a press conference, the fighters manage to get you to up the bonuses. Do you think there's an argument that maybe you should just up them to...
I think tonight showed that we should not, no. Upping them doesn't change anything. It doesn't make anybody fight any harder. It doesn't change anything. I'm not doing this again.
So the reason I show that is because I think this is one of the reasons they did not resign Mokaev, because they believe he was boring, because the UFC and Dana White seems to be catering towards the ultimate casuals nowadays, because Mokaev, he's not only 23, he's 23 years old at the time, he's 24 now. He had 7 wins in the UFC, and 4 of those were finishes. So more than half of his wins in the UFC were via finish. But Dana's the ultimate casual. He didn't enjoy UFC 304, which I thought was a great night, honestly. It wasn't like the craziest card ever, but it was a solid fight card with solid fights. And Dana's crying about it afterwards. And luckily, we got a little bit of pushback, and then Dana said the most delusional, embarrassing, mentally ill statement I've ever heard out of Dana White's mouth. You'll hear that in a little bit.
Ever. Today was the last day that I'm doing that, yeah. Not saying that in the future the bonuses couldn't get up, but I'm not going to be at a press conference and say 200, 300, fucking never again. Never again. So you can thank everybody on this card for that.
And that's partially Mokaev, because him and Kopp hyped up the fight. They were buried on the prelims, and then they didn't deliver in terms of the hype that they generated for the fight. And then also, obviously, he's mad that Belal dominated Leon Edwards. But let's carry on.
Damn, dude.
Yeah. Nobody fought any harder. There was no sense of urgency. Holy shit, I want the 100,000. 7 straight. Who gives a fuck?
Dude points out it was 3 a.m. It was 3 a.m. because they decided to do it 3 a.m. local time. And, of course, Dana doesn't care, but now he says the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my entire life.
It's fucking 7 o'clock in Vegas, so.
What does that have to... I don't understand what that has to do with anything. He said it's 7 a.m. in Vegas. It was 3 a.m. Well, it's 7 a.m. in Vegas. That's a non sequitur. It makes absolutely no sense. It's been a few months, but I remember when I first heard this, I just wanted to jump through the screen. But yeah, it's 7 p.m. in Vegas. He's probably hanging out with Jelly Bean and the Nelk boys, and gambling with Steve will do it. But yeah, it's 7 p.m. in Vegas. We'll listen to a little bit the rest of this.
Whatever. Yeah. Never again.
Okay. And last
7 straight fucking decisions. Yeah. The 100,000 was a real big fucking woohoo. Let's get it, boys. Fuck that shit. Never again.
Yeah, ultimate casual. Decisions don't mean the fights aren't good. But then again, this is a guy that crapped on Movsar Evloev versus Arnold Allen, which was literally one of the best fights, if not the best fight on UFC 297. But Dana acted like it wasn't good because it went to decision. Meanwhile, he's like, yeah, we're never doing those bonuses again. Can't wait to get some Coke after this. That's essentially what Dana's doing here. Next clip is specifically about Muhammad Mokaev, where he basically releases him publicly here. He says, look, we're not going to re-sign him. We have no interest in him. Basically, that's what he says. You'll hear it for yourself, and you can make your own determination.
So much bad shit that happened in the behind the scenes with that thing.
So much bad stuff. They got into altercations. Behind the scenes. Oh my God, it's so horrible. Remember, Dana White doesn't put his fighters on a leash. I've already exposed this in another video, so I'm not even going to show that clip. But remember, Dana does not keep his fighters on any type of leash. Freedom of speech, brother. Freedom of speech, brother. Our fighters can do whatever they want, brother. But remember, there's the altercations. They definitely don't use those to sell fights all the time. They don't use bad blood to sell fights all the time. Dana doesn't always say, oh, this is the fight business. But yeah, there's some bad stuff that happened, but let's continue.
And yeah, not good.
Mokaev said that his contract is up, and he made this interesting remark that said someone at the UFC told him to stop shooting for these takedowns so much, and maybe he'll get this contract that he wants. Is that true, and what do you think he'll bring him?
Right there sealed his fate. Because if you want to know my personal opinion, we still don't have the exact answers of why the UFC did not re-sign Muhammad Mokaev when his contract was up, even though he's an undefeated prospect, arguably the number one contender in the flyweight division. I think it's a combination of Dana White and the UFC and the Dana White sycophants wanting to cater to the casuals, that Mokaev was boring. I think it's a combination of him wanting to fight out his deal. I think Mokaev made a point of wanting to fight out his deal. And I also think they hate it. They absolutely hate it that he said this publicly. I think had he not said this publicly, there would have been a chance that they re-sign him. But now that he said this publicly at the presser, there's no way they were going to re-sign him. And the UFC, I mean, Dana White and the UFC are such egomaniacs. They almost use the UFC brand against certain fighters, but we'll get to that in a second. I want to listen to the rest of this clip.
I'm back.
Yeah, that's what we tell guys. We tell guys how to fight and tell them we've been doing this for a long fucking time.
By the way, so he admits it there, but not really. That's sarcasm, okay? But in a second, he actually does admit it, okay? Genuinely admits that someone told Mokaev not to shoot takedowns, which, if you watch the way he fought in that fight against Manel Kape, you could clearly see something was up. And we've heard from other guys, people have kind of alluded to it. There's been some speculation on certain fights. The UFC, if they're telling guys how to fight and how to implement their game plan and what kind of style to fight, by influencing them with potential contracts that literally should be illegal. That's literally, you're essentially putting your finger on the scale and trying to fix fights. But let's listen to the rest of this.
I'm sure one of the matchmakers probably said something to him or whatever, but
I mean, if that is an actual admission, I'm going to rewind that just so you guys can hear that one more time. Because he sarcastically admits to it, and then what does he say immediately afterwards? I mean, he basically says that I'm sure that happened.
Contract that he wants. Is that true, and do you think he'll bring him back?
Yeah, that's what we tell guys. We tell guys how to fight and tell them we've been doing this for a long fucking time.
Sarcasm. Okay, now listen to the next statement.
I'm sure one of the matchmakers probably said something to him or whatever, but
AKA, don't be boring and don't grapple, because they're total casuals and all they care about is profit nowadays, so they want to cater to ultimate casuals.
Yeah, the matchmakers aren't big fans of his for many different reasons.
By the way, where's the Dagestani privilege in this? There's a lot of people who discriminate against Dagestani fighters, hate the fighters because they're Dagestani, and say, Dagestani privilege, Dagestani privilege. Where's the Dagestani privilege here? Undefeated prospect, arguably the number one contender, and he got released from the organization.
And not just there's a lot of people who shoot takedowns in this business. You know, a lot of guys that fight with that type of style, but it's a lot more than just that.
But Mokaev is the guy that you'd want to bring back to the UFC because he said his contract is totally done now.
Yeah, he is. He's under contract. He's not under contract anymore.
Okay, but would you be interested in keeping him around in the fall?
I think the PFL is going to get a great undefeated guy.
Really?
Good luck to him. Yeah.
What about Manel? Because we saw even before the fight even started.
So I think PFL is going to get a great undefeated guy, even though PFL doesn't have a flyweight division.
He was trying to run it. Muhammad Mokaev, the security had to get in there before the first bell even rang.
Yeah, because just so much dumb shit has happened. I mean, we couldn't even have a face-off. But it was one of those typical kind of fights. We've all seen this before over the years. Oh, I can't wait to get to you. I can't wait to get to you. Oh, I'm going to fucking kill you. And then 5 minutes and they don't do anything for the first 5 minutes of the fight. I mean, it's just, we kind of figured that's how that fight would go. It's, historically, that's how they go.
And last one on this, when you said the PFL is going to get an undefeated fighter, is that his fighting style? Is that he's asking for too much money?
Okay, so he's asked specifically, well, what's going on? What's the problem?
Why?
None of the above. Listen, for whatever reason, listen, the stuff that played out here over the last several months, it started at the PI and other stories of this breaking out, plus many other things. These guys don't want to re-sign him.
All the things that happened. Oh, they got into an altercation at the PI, so we're not re-signing him. Listen, it actually disgusted me that a lot of fans kind of sided with this. They were like, "Yeah, cut Mokaev. We don't like Mokaev. He's Dagestani. Oh no, we don't want him to. We don't want another Dagestani with a belt." I mean, how delusional is this? For the company, for Dana White, who parades around and says, freedom of speech, brother. We don't got our fighters on no leashes. Oh, he did a lot of things that we didn't like. And he said this again at a Dana White's Contender Series post-fight. Check this out, which he elaborated a little bit more here. Listen to this.
You mentioned how usually think how the rivalries usually end up being not so good inside the fight. I guess people felt that way with the Mokaev fight back in England, and we all know what happened with Mokaev after. But he went out and said that he'd fight for free to get back in the UFC as if since his dream. Did he ever go up to you guys and actually talk about stuff like that?
Of course, nobody's going to fight for free. People can talk all
Yeah,
the
I
shit.
figured,
People can talk all the shit they want about how we pay, but nobody's fighting for free. Yeah, it is what it is. You know, I always say this, that this is an opportunity to be here and to perform in front of the entire world. And, you know, he's just a guy that did everything wrong and pissed these guys off.
Remember, we don't have a leash. We don't put our fighters on a leash. Freedom of speech, brother. You can do whatever you want here. It's the fight business. Remember that. He parades himself around and takes all the praise for that. But essentially, he's here saying, yeah, we canceled Mokaev. He did everything wrong. We didn't like what he did here.
I wasn't involved in any of the stuff that happened with him, but, you know, the matchmakers and Hunter were, and they weren't happy with him. They weren't happy with the way he acted. They weren't happy with a lot of things he did and said, and, you know, yeah, I guess you can look back now and regret it, but you did it. You did it.
They weren't happy with some of the things he said, a.k.a. they told me not to grapple. They wanted me to be more excited.
And you put yourself in this position.
Which is crazy because essentially this highlights a problem of the UFC and Dana White being such egomaniacs and having such a monopoly on the sport that essentially the only way I can describe it is the UFC goes to certain areas in the country, all over the world, to certain arenas. And nowadays, basically, they won't go anywhere unless you're paying them. So it used to be the UFC would go to all these different, states and arenas and they would expand out all across the world. And they still do to a certain extent. But now they don't want to go anywhere unless the site is paying them, unless they're getting a site fee. Australia is paying the UFC to come there. Saudi Arabia is paying the UFC to come there. There's, most of these places have a contract with the UFC to pay them to go there. Essentially, the UFC has so much leverage over these fighters because a lot of the fighters want to be there. So now they don't like some of the things that Mokaev did, even though the UFC claims they have all the best guys in the world. They'll say, oh, look, we don't need you. We don't care about you. Unless you're out there singing our praises left and right, if you do anything that we don't like, we got you on a leash and we got you on a very short leash and you're walking on thin ice. Essentially, that's what the UFC is doing now. Theoretically, they want the fighters paying those site fees. And if you're not an absolute suck-up or a total full-blown UFC star that has some leverage over the UFC, essentially the UFC doesn't care. And that's exactly what they did with Mokaev. I think it was a combination of things. I think they didn't like his fight style. I think they saw some of the behind the scenes antics. I don't think they cared that much about that. And then the fact that he snitched on him at the press conference and said, look, they told me not to grapple anymore. I think that was enough for the UFC to say, okay, we don't want to be in the Muhammad Mokaev business anymore, which is crazy to me, considering he's one of the best in the world. And then Dana's like, yeah, he did some things we don't like, and he said some things we don't like. Okay, look, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I exposed this in a whole other video. So what about Sean Strickland getting into a brawl in the crowd? What about Greg Hardy? Okay, they had no problem signing Greg Hardy, okay? What about John Jones? I mean, incident after incident. And I understand John Jones is a star, but again, see? He has a star, but the UFC acts as if they pick and choose when they want a champion. Oh, we don't care what anyone does. We don't care what anyone says. It doesn't matter to us. But then Mokaev, who's not a big star, and my point is, it's not even that I'm complaining that the UFC holds these guys accountable for certain things. It's the fact that they parade around and masquerade as, we let everyone do whatever they want, but they don't actually do that. It all comes down to just simply money. And where my biggest problem with this is, we don't even know if the UFC has the best flyweight in the world on their roster. We don't know if the UFC has the best heavyweight in the world on the roster. I could pull up a clip of him talking about, yeah, Francis was a bad guy and we don't want to be in business with him. When meanwhile, there's nothing that Francis has ever done that anybody has ever come out publicly and criticized Francis for. He hasn't gotten in any trouble. Oh, let's not even talk about this. Conor McGregor. I've already made multiple videos on this. I'm not going to talk about it. But all these guys, the UFC had no problem having them on the roster when it made sense financially for the UFC. But Mokaev maybe says a few things they don't like, and they get rid of him. And what's insane about this is Mokaev is 13-0, okay? He is now 24 years old. 24 years old. 13-0. You look at his, wins and losses, or you look at his resume, not his wins and losses, because he doesn't have any losses. And he has 7 UFC wins, 4 finishes. Beat Manel Kape, ranked in the top 10. Beat Alex Perez, ranked in the top 10. Beat Tim Elliott, who's ranked in the top 15. And he finished a lot of these guys, and even the unranked guys that he beat, look at the unranked guys he beat. Cody Durden, Charles Johnson, Malcolm Gordon, Jafel Filio. All decent wins, unranked wins. This is the number one contender for the flyweight division, but instead, you have Alexandre Pantoja, who is the flyweight champion right now, who, has looked more dominant than ever. He's fighting a debutant in Kaya Sakura in his UFC debut and absolutely starched him, by the way. Destroyed him, finished him in the second round. Oh, he fought Steve Erceg, who had like 3 fights in the UFC at that point in time and was not more deserving over Muhammad Mokaev. And then you look at the UFC rankings, and I actually took notes on this just because I could remember everything. Brandon Royval, number one in the rankings right now. Brandon Royval is 0-2 against Pantoja, got finished 1 time. Brandon Moreno is 0-3, got finished 1 time. One of those times was when the Ultimate Fighter was an exhibition, so you may not see it on his record. Amir Albazi coming off a loss. Kai Kara France, 0-1. They fought on the Ultimate Fighter. Tashiro Taira coming off a loss. Alex Perez literally lost to Muhammad Mokaev. Asu Almabayev is literally the next deserving contender at flyweight right now, who's on like a 4-fight win streak, but not against the best opposition. Steve Erceg, 0-1 against Pantoja. Manel Kape, he lost to Mokaev in his most recent fight. He has a fight coming up this weekend. Tim Elliott lost to Muhammad Mokaev, got finished by Muhammad Mokaev. This is insane. We just went through the entire top 10. There's not a single deserving contender here outside of maybe Asu Almabayev, who hasn't really beat elite opposition. So you really have nobody. Look. Kaya Sakura, debutante. Steve Erceg didn't even deserve a title shot. Brandon Royval, 0-2. Brandon Moreno, 0-3. Alex Perez already lost. I know I just went through this, but it's insane. It's insane. And he has a win over Manel Kape as well. So not only did Manel Kape lose to Mokaev, but he also lost to Pantoja. This makes perfect sense. The UFC needs to say, look, here's how the UFC can have like an off-ramp to re-signing Muhammad Mokaev without really truly needing to like change course. They could say, look, Mokaev went out and he got another win. He got a finish in the first round. He's looked good. He's 13-0. He's undefeated. And just re-sign him. How can the UFC how can Dana White and the UFC, can they be such egomaniacs that they see a guy who's undefeated, who has multiple top 10 ranked wins in the UFC, multiple finishes in the UFC. By the way, he has 8 finishes in 13 fights, in MMA fights, okay? He has 4 finishes and 7 UFC wins. And how can they... And also, he has elite level grappling and elite level jiu-jitsu. His striking is getting better. He's not even in his prime yet. And Pantoja needs a contender. They're literally signing dudes from one championship to fight Pantoja. They can easily say, look, he went out there, he got a win. He learned his lesson. Maybe he's going to be on his best behavior. By the way, Mokaev says he's getting paid 3 times what he was getting paid in the UFC by Brave FC, which is just insanity. But the UFC could easily say, you know what? We need a fresh contender. Let's pay Mokaev. You know how big that would be for the flyweight division? I know it sounds crazy. I know people are going to say, Joey, what are you talking about? It's not going to be 1 million pay-per-view buys. I'm not saying it's going to even be a headliner for a pay-per-view. But that would be a very interesting storyline heading into Alexandre Pantoja's next title defense. If he fights Mokaev, Mokaev returns. The UFC's redheaded stepchild that they got rid of because they didn't like some of the things that he said. But he's getting a second opportunity. The UFC's being charitable. It's almost good PR. The fans that were clapping Dana White for cutting him, I'm curious, what do you think now that the division's almost completely dead? Of course, can he fight Royval again? Sure. Can he fight Moreno again? Sure. But he's already beaten these guys. We need a fresh contender in the division, and Mokaev is most deserving right now today. So I'm really hoping that the UFC reevaluates. They say, look, we need another contender. Mokaev has been kind of sucking up to us a little bit. He's been nothing but positive about the UFC since he left. It's clear that Mokaev is on the path in an attempt to try to return to the UFC. Granted, he beat a bum in Brave FC, but that dude was on short notice. There was multiple pullouts, whatnot. But Mokaev went out there and did what he needed to do, choked him out in the first round. He has elite jiu-jitsu, elite submission skills. He's hard to submit. There's guys that have, Jafel Filio, I think, had him in a knee bar, refused to tap, survived there. How can you not book Alexandre Pantoja versus Muhammad Mokaev? It'd be a super compelling flyweight matchup. The UFC needs to re-sign Muhammad Mokaev. Hopefully they do. Hopefully they say, you know what, we're going to give this guy a second chance. Get all the public, positive publicity you can get. We're going to give this guy an opportunity. And what a story it would be if he returns to the UFC and gets the belt off of a dominant champion, Alexandre Pantoja. Would be a great story. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for watching.